The blistering summer sun beat down on Grace Bellamy's frail shoulders as she stood at the graveside of her father, the last family she had in this world. Colorado Territory, 1876, was no place for a woman alone, especially one whose family ranch was drowning in debt. The banker's words still echoed in her ears from that morning. "You've got 2 weeks to settle your father's debts, Miss Bellamy, or I'll have no choice but to seize the property." Grace wiped away her tears with a gloved hand. 22 years old and facing ruin, she had few options in the rugged mining town of Silver Creek. The women who lost everything either became schoolteachers if educated, seamstresses if skilled, or saloon girls if desperate. Grace was running dangerously close to the third option. "Miss Bellamy," a gruff voice called as she turned to leave the cemetery. Harold Grayson, the town's most successful cattle rancher, stood before her, hat in hand. At 40, his weathered face and stern demeanor had frightened her as a child. Now, his considerable wealth represented something else entirely: salvation. "I was sorry to hear about your father," he said, his voice betraying no real emotion. "Fine man. Poor businessman." Grace bristled but kept her composure. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Grayson." "I'll be direct, Miss Bellamy. I know about your situation. The bank has already approached me about your property. Prime grazing land, even with that dried-up creek." He studied her face. "I'd like to make you an offer." Grace felt her spine stiffen. "The ranch isn't for sale, Mr. Grayson." A hint of a smile crossed his lips. "Not that kind of offer. I'm proposing marriage." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "Marriage, but you hardly know me." "I know enough. You need security. I need a wife to manage my household and provide me with children. I'm offering you a solution to your problems." His eyes traveled over her face dispassionately. "You're young, healthy, and come from good stock. I'll settle your father's debts and you'll want for nothing." Grace felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff. Marriage to Harold Grayson meant security, respectability, and survival. But at what cost? She thought of her mother, who had loved her father deeply despite their hardships. Could she enter a loveless marriage with this cold, calculating man? "I'll give you 2 days to consider," Grayson said, replacing his hat. "Though I don't see what choice you have, unless you fancy working for Madame Rosa at the Silver Slipper." After he left, Grace stood alone among the graves, the weight of her future pressing down on her like the packed earth on her father's coffin. 2 days later, Grace sat in the bank manager's office, her hands folded tightly in her lap as Harold Grayson signed the papers that settled her father's debts. Her own signature on the marriage certificate felt like signing away her soul, but she had made her choice. For survival, she would become Mrs. Harold Grayson. "The ceremony will take place next Sunday," Grayson announced to the banker. "Just a small affair at Judge Porter's house. No need for fuss." Grace nodded mutely. She had agreed to his terms, a marriage of convenience with clearly defined expectations. She would manage his household, accompany him to social events, and bear his children. In return, she would have financial security and maintain her standing in the community. Love wasn't part of the arrangement. As they left the bank, Grayson offered his arm. "You've made the sensible choice, Grace. Many women in this territory would gladly trade places with you." Grace took his arm, feeling the eyes of townsfolk upon them. "I know my good fortune, Mr. Grayson," she replied, the words bitter on her tongue. "Harold," he corrected. "You should begin calling me Harold." The week before the wedding passed in a blur. Grace packed her few belongings and said goodbye to the only home she had ever known. The small ranch where she had grown up with loving parents would soon belong to the bank, then likely to Grayson himself to expand his already vast holdings. On her wedding day, Grace wore her mother's dress, altered hastily by the town seamstress. No friends attended. Only the judge, his wife as witness, and Harold's foreman, a taciturn man named Mills, who looked as uncomfortable as Grace felt. The judge pronounced them husband and wife, with little ceremony. Harold's kiss was brief and perfunctory, his hand firm on her lower back as they exited the judge's parlor. "Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Grayson," Harold said, as his driver helped her into the carriage that would take them to Grayson Ranch, 5 miles outside of town. Grace looked out at the rolling hills and vast expanses of Harold's property. Cattle dotted the landscape, a testament to his business acumen. The main house rose in the distance, an imposing 2-story structure that dwarfed her family's modest home. "Your responsibilities will begin tomorrow," Harold informed her as they approached. "The housekeeper, Mrs. Daniels, will acquaint you with the staff and routines. I expect you to take over management immediately." Grace nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, Harold. I have business in Denver next week. You'll remain here to settle in. When I return, we'll discuss other aspects of our arrangement." The meaning behind his words was clear, and Grace felt a chill despite the warm June air. She had traded one form of survival for another, and now she would have to pay the price. Life at Grayson Ranch fell into a predictable rhythm. Grace rose early each morning to oversee the household staff, planned menus with the cook, and managed the domestic affairs of the large home. Harold spent his days with his cattle business, returning for dinner promptly at 6, where he would question Grace about the day's activities before retreating to his study. After 2 weeks, Harold returned from his Denver trip with gifts, expensive dresses, and jewelry that felt more like shackles than presents. That night, he came to her bedroom for the first time. The experience left Grace feeling hollow and used, but she reminded herself that this was part of their arrangement. She had married for survival, and this was the cost. Months passed. Grace performed her duties as mistress of Grayson Ranch with quiet efficiency, earning the respect of the household staff, if not their affection. Harold treated her with the same detached consideration one might show a valuable piece of property well maintained, but ultimately owned. In town, the wives of other ranchers and businessmen invited her to their social events, curious about the young woman who had caught the elusive Harold Grayson. Grace smiled and played her part, all while feeling increasingly trapped in her gilded cage. The first real disruption to her carefully constructed life came 6 months into her marriage, when a band of cattle rustlers targeted Grayson Ranch. Harold was away on business, leaving his foreman and ranch hands to defend the property. 3 men were injured, and a sizable portion of the herd was stolen. Grace tended to the injured men herself, staying up through the night changing bandages and administering medicine from the ranch's limited supplies. When Harold returned 2 days later, his fury was palpable. "Those bastards will pay," he seethed, pacing the study while Grace stood silently by. "I've wired the marshal, but he's tracking another gang near the territorial border." "Perhaps we should hire additional hands," Grace suggested cautiously. "The men are overworked as it is." Harold glanced at her with surprise, as if he'd forgotten she could speak. "I've already sent for some men I know from Texas. They'll be here within the week." The Texas men arrived 5 days later, a rough-looking bunch led by a man Harold introduced as Heath Garrison. Unlike the other hired guns with their hard eyes and trigger-ready hands, Heath carried himself with a quiet confidence that immediately set him apart. "Mrs. Grayson," Heath said, tipping his hat when Harold introduced them. His voice was deep but gentle, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. "Pleased to make your acquaintance." "Mr. Garrison will be staying in the foreman's quarters," Harold informed her. "The others will bunk in the ranch hand's cabin. See that they are properly fed." Grace nodded, trying not to stare at the tall stranger. Something about Heath Garrison stirred feelings she had carefully suppressed since her wedding day: curiosity, interest, and an inexplicable warmth. Over the following weeks, Heath proved his worth to Harold by tracking down the rustlers and recovering most of the stolen cattle. The other Texans moved on, but Heath remained, promoted to assistant foreman after displaying his exceptional skills with horses and cattle. Grace began to notice Heath around the property more often, breaking horses in the corral, giving instructions to the ranch hands, or consulting with Harold in the study. Unlike her husband, Heath always acknowledged her with a respectful nod or tip of his hat, sometimes even engaging in brief conversation about the weather or ranch affairs. One afternoon, as Grace was returning from her weekly visit to town, her horse stepped into a prairie dog hole and threw her. The fall knocked the breath from her lungs, and for a terrifying moment she couldn't move. Then strong hands were gently helping her sit up. "Easy now, Mrs. Grayson," Heath said, his face etched with concern. "Are you hurt?" Grace winced as she tried to stand. "My ankle," she gasped. Without hesitation, Heath scooped her into his arms and carried her to his horse. "I'll get you back to the ranch." The feeling of his arms around her, strong yet careful, sent her heart racing in a way Harold's touch never had. As they rode double back to the ranch house, Grace was acutely aware of Heath's chest against her back, his breath warm on her neck. At the house, Heath carried her to the parlor and called for Mrs. Daniels. "The doctor should take a look at that ankle," he said, reluctantly stepping back as the housekeeper took over. "Thank you, Mr. Garrison," Grace said, her cheeks flushed. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." "Just doing my job, madam," he replied, but his lingering gaze suggested otherwise. Dr. Patterson confirmed that Grace's ankle was merely sprained, not broken. Harold, upon returning from a neighboring ranch, showed minimal concern, instructing the housekeeper to attend to his wife's needs before retreating to his study. The following day, Heath brought a bouquet of wildflowers to the house. "For your recovery, Mrs. Grayson," he said when Mrs. Daniels allowed him into the parlor where Grace was resting with her bandaged ankle elevated. "That's very thoughtful, Mr. Garrison," Grace replied, touched by the gesture. No one, not even Harold, had given her flowers since before her wedding. "Heath, please," he said, his voice low as he glanced toward the doorway to ensure they weren't overheard. "If you don't mind." "Then you must call me Grace," she responded, a small thrill running through her at this minor rebellion. Their conversation that afternoon was brief, but meaningful. Heath spoke of his life in Texas, his years working cattle drives, and his hopes to someday have a place of his own. Grace found herself sharing more than she intended: her childhood on her father's struggling ranch, her love of books, and her dreams of seeing more of the world than just Colorado territory. "Sounds like you've got a restless spirit," Heath observed with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Not many opportunities for adventure as a rancher's wife, I imagine." Grace looked away. "We make do with the hand we're dealt, Mr. Garrison Heath. I've learned that lesson well enough." Something in her tone must have revealed more than she intended, because Heath's expression softened with understanding. "Some hands can be redealt, Grace," he said quietly before taking his leave. That night, lying beside her sleeping husband, Grace thought of Heath's words and the warmth in his eyes. For the first time since her father's death, she allowed herself to imagine a different kind of life, one where she wasn't merely surviving, but living. As spring turned to summer, Grace found herself looking forward to her brief encounters with Heath. Sometimes they were nothing more than a passing greeting as he rode out with the other hands. Other times, they might exchange a few words about ranch business or the weather. But occasionally, when Harold was away, they would have longer conversations. During one such conversation, as Grace supervised the planting of a kitchen garden, Heath stopped to help her with some heavy lifting. "Harold doesn't strike me as the type to appreciate fresh vegetables," Heath commented as he positioned a trellis for climbing beans. Grace smiled. "He isn't, but the cook is. And what Harold doesn't know about the household won't bother him, as long as dinner is served on time." Heath studied her for a moment. "You've adapted well to ranch life, considering your circumstances?" Grace stiffened. "What do you know of my circumstances?" Only what people say in town? Heath replied carefully. That your father died in debt, and Harold offered you security. Gossip travels quickly in Silver Creek, Grace said, her tone defensive. It wasn't meant as criticism, Heath assured her. There's no shame in doing what you must to survive. Grace looked at him sharply. Is that what you think I did? Married for survival? Heath met her gaze steadily. Didn't you? The directness of his question left her speechless. No one had ever confronted her so bluntly about her marriage. After a moment, she nodded slightly. Yes, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I did. Instead of judgment, Heath's expression showed only compassion. We all do what we must, he said, but survival isn't the same as living. Before she could respond, they heard the approach of Harold's horse. Heath quickly returned to his work, and Grace to hers, but his words echoed in her mind. Survival isn't the same as living. That summer, tensions in the territory escalated as conflicts between ranchers over water rights and grazing lands grew more heated. Harold became increasingly preoccupied with protecting his interests, often traveling to Denver to meet with other wealthy ranchers and territorial officials. During one such absence, a fire broke out in one of the barns during a violent thunderstorm. Grace was awakened by the commotion and ran outside to find ranch hands forming a bucket line, while Heath directed efforts to save the livestock trapped inside. Without hesitation, Grace joined the effort, hitching up her nightdress and passing buckets alongside the men. When one of the young stable boys collapsed from smoke inhalation, Grace dragged him to safety and administered aid. By dawn, the fire was extinguished. The barn was damaged but salvageable, and all but 2 horses had been saved. Grace, soot-covered and exhausted, was helping tend to minor burns and injuries when Heath approached her. You showed real courage tonight, he said, his voice hoarse from smoke. Not many women would have done what you did. Grace dabbed at a cut on his forehead with a damp cloth. Not many women have the opportunity to discover what they're capable of. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them. Heath's hand came up to cover hers, holding it against his face for a heartbeat longer than necessary. You deserve so much more than this life, Grace, he whispered. The intensity in his gaze frightened and thrilled her. She stepped back, suddenly aware of the impropriety of their closeness, of the danger in these feelings. I should change before the household awakens, she said, retreating toward the main house. When Harold returned 2 days later, he was more concerned with the financial loss of the barn and livestock than with Grace's role in fighting the fire. His dismissive attitude contrasted sharply with Heath's appreciation, making the differences between the 2 men all the more apparent. That night, Harold came to her bedroom as was his custom twice weekly. Grace closed her eyes and endured his attentions, but for the first time, she found herself imagining another man's hands, another man's kiss. The realization horrified her, and after Harold returned to his own room, she wept silently into her pillow. Grace knew she was treading dangerous ground. Attraction to another man, especially one employed by her husband, could lead to disaster. She resolved to maintain her distance from Heath, to focus on her duties as Harold's wife and mistress of the ranch. For weeks, she succeeded in avoiding private encounters with Heath, speaking to him only when necessary and always in the presence of others. If he noticed her withdrawal, he didn't comment on it, though she sometimes caught him watching her with a puzzled expression. Then came the incident that changed everything. Harold had organized a cattle drive to Denver, taking most of the ranch hands with him. Heath remained behind to oversee the property with a skeleton crew. 3 days into Harold's absence, a group of men from a neighboring ranch deliberately diverted a stream that supplied water to Grayson land, a provocative move in the escalating water disputes. Heath confronted them at the property line, accompanied by the few hands left at the ranch. Words were exchanged, then threats, and finally gunshots. By the time Grace arrived on the scene, Responding to the sound of firing, one of the Grayson hands was dead, and Heath was wounded. Blood seeping through his shirt from a bullet to his shoulder. The neighboring ranchers had retreated, but Grace knew they would return with reinforcements. With the ranch vulnerable and Heath injured, she made a decision. "Get him to the house," she ordered the remaining hands, "then gather the women and children from the bunkhouses. We're going to fortify the main house until help arrives." For the next 24 hours, Grace transformed from obedient wife to commanding general. She positioned the few able-bodied men at strategic points around the house, armed the women who could shoot, and tended to Heath's wound herself. "You should have left me at the bunkhouse," Heath protested weakly as she cleaned and bandaged his shoulder in Harold's study, now converted to a makeshift infirmary. "And let you bleed to death?" Grace asked, her hands steady despite her fear. "What kind of person would that make me?" "The kind who doesn't risk everything for a hired hand," Heath replied, watching her face intently. "If Harold knew how you were looking at me right now—" "Harold isn't here," Grace interrupted. "He's off protecting his precious cattle while leaving his home defenseless. He may own this land, but right now, I'm the one defending it." When the neighboring ranchers returned, there were 12 of them, expecting to find an unprotected property ripe for intimidation. Instead, they found a fortress with determined defenders. Grace herself stood on the front porch, rifle in hand, when their leader approached. "This is between Grayson and us, madam," the man called. "No need for women and children to get hurt." "My husband isn't here," Grace replied, her voice carrying across the yard. "But I am, and I speak for Grayson Ranch. You've already killed one of our men and wounded another. Leave now, or the next blood spilled will be yours." Something in her tone, the absolute certainty, the fearlessness, made the man hesitate. After a tense standoff, the intruders withdrew, unwilling to fire on a woman or risk the consequences when Harold Grayson returned with his full crew. Inside the house, Heath had dragged himself to a window despite his injury, ready to intervene if necessary. When Grace returned inside, flushed with victory, but shaking with delayed fear, their eyes met across the room. "That," Heath said with undisguised admiration, "was the bravest thing I've ever seen a person do." Later that night, with the house still on alert but the immediate danger past, Grace checked Heath's wound for signs of infection. The study was quiet, lit only by a single lamp, the rest of the household having settled into uneasy sleep. "You should rest," Heath said, watching her tired face in the lamplight. "You've done enough." Grace shook her head. "I couldn't sleep anyway." "Because you're afraid they'll come back?" "Because I'm afraid of what I feel when I'm with you," she admitted, the words escaping before she could stop them. The confession hung in the air between them. Heath reached for her hand, his touch gentle but insistent. "Grace," he said softly. "Look at me." She raised her eyes to his, seeing in them everything she had been trying to deny. "I've never met anyone like you," Heath continued. "You married for survival, but you were meant for so much more. You deserve to be loved, truly loved, by a man who sees your worth." "Heath, don't," Grace whispered, though she didn't pull her hand away. "I'm married. Whatever I feel, whatever you feel, it can't happen." "Can't it?" he challenged. "Are you going to spend your whole life in a loveless marriage just surviving? Is that enough for you now that you know what you're capable of?" Grace stood abruptly, moving away from his touch. "It has to be. I made vows." "Vows to a man who treats you like property," Heath said, his voice hardening. "A man who left you unprotected while he pursued his business interests." "That doesn't change my obligation," Grace insisted, though her resolve was weakening. "What would you have me do? Run away? Become an outcast?" Heath struggled to his feet, wincing with the effort. "I would have you live freely," he said, closing the distance between them. "Not just survive, but truly live. I can't, Grace whispered, even as she leaned toward him. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question rather than a demand. When Grace didn't pull away, Heath deepened the kiss, his uninjured arm encircling her waist and drawing her closer. In that moment, Grace understood what had been missing from her life passion, tenderness, the feeling of being truly desired for herself, not for what she could provide. When they finally separated, both breathless, the reality of their situation crashed back upon them. Grace stepped back, touching her fingers to her lips as if to preserve the feeling. "This is impossible," she said, though her heart argued otherwise. "Nothing is impossible," Heath countered, "not for a woman who stood down 12 armed men with nothing but courage and conviction." Before they could say more, there was a commotion outside riders approaching. Grace hurried to the window to see the marshal and a posse arriving, summoned by one of the ranch hands who had slipped away during the confrontation to seek help. The moment between them was broken, but something had fundamentally changed. As Grace went to meet the marshal, she knew she could never go back to her life of quiet submission. Whether with Heath or on her own, she would find a way to truly live, not merely survive. Harold returned 3 days later, furious about the attack on his property, but grudgingly impressed by Grace's handling of the situation. The marshal had already arrested the neighboring rancher responsible, and tensions in the area had temporarily subsided. "You showed surprising backbone," Harold told Grace over dinner their first night together. "Though you should have sent for me immediately." "There wasn't time," Grace replied, meeting his gaze with new confidence, "and the ranch needed immediate defense." Harold studied her, noting the change in her demeanor. "Garrison did well too, despite his injury. I'm promoting him to foreman. Mills is getting too old for the position anyway." Grace kept her expression neutral, though her heart raced at the mention of Heath. "He risked his life defending your property. He deserves recognition." In the weeks that followed, Grace and Heath maintained a careful distance in public, but their feelings continued to grow. Occasionally, they would find moments alone, brief conversations in the stable, a chance meeting on a riding path, a few precious minutes in the kitchen garden where they could speak freely. During one such encounter, Heath revealed his plans. "I've been saving for years," he told her. "I have enough to buy a small spread in Wyoming territory. Good land, with plenty of water. I could build something there, something of my own." Grace's heart ached at the thought of him leaving. "When will you go?" "That depends on you," Heath said, his eyes intense. "I won't ask you to break your vows. That has to be your decision. But if you decided this life wasn't enough for you anymore, if you wanted something more than just survival—" He trailed off, the implication clear. "You're asking me to leave everything behind," Grace said, though the idea was not as frightening as it once would have been. "I'm asking you to choose freedom," Heath corrected, "to live the life you were meant for, not the one circumstance forced upon you." Grace didn't answer, couldn't answer. The choice before her was monumental security versus passion, obligation versus freedom, survival versus truly living. As autumn approached, Harold prepared for a lengthy business trip to St. Louis, where he planned to negotiate contracts with meat packers for the following year's cattle. He would be gone for at least a month, perhaps longer. "You'll manage the ranch accounts in my absence," he instructed Grace the night before his departure. "Garrison will handle the men and the livestock. Try not to make any decisions that can wait for my return." Grace nodded dutifully, but inside, her mind was racing with possibilities. A month alone, with Heath nearby and Harold hundreds of miles away. Time to think, to feel, to decide. The day after Harold left, Heath came to the house on ranch business. Their interaction was properly formal until Mrs. Daniels left the room. Then Heath's expression softened. "I've given my notice," he said quietly. "I'm leaving for Wyoming in 3 weeks, whether Harold is back or not." Grace felt as though the floor had dropped beneath her. So soon? I need to establish the place before winter sets in, Heath explained. And I can't. He hesitated, then continued more softly. I can't stay here and watch you with him, now that I know what could be. The days that followed were agony for Grace. She performed her duties mechanically while her heart and mind waged war. Could she really leave the security of her marriage for an uncertain future with Heath? What would become of her if she stayed? What would become of her if she left? 2 weeks into Harold's absence, as Grace was reviewing the ranch accounts in the study, she found something disturbing. Discrepancies in the financial records, payments to unknown parties, and a pattern of transactions that suggested Harold was involved in something illegal. Further investigation revealed the truth. Harold Grayson was financing a group of men who were driving smaller ranchers out of business through intimidation and violence, then acquiring their lands at reduced prices. The neighboring rancher who had attacked Grayson Ranch had been one of their victims who fought back. That night, Grace confided her discovery to Heath as they walked in the moonlit garden, far from prying eyes. I suspected something wasn't right, Heath admitted. The way some of the smaller spreads have been failing, it seemed too convenient for Grayson. All this time, I thought I was married to a cold, unloving man, Grace said, her voice tight with anger. But it's worse than that. He's ruthless, corrupt. Heath took her hands in his. Come with me, he urged. We'll leave tonight. Take only what you need, what's truly yours. By the time he returns, we'll be establishing our own place. Grace looked up at the stars, thinking of her father, her mother, the values they had instilled in her. What would they think of her now, considering abandoning her marriage vows? But then, what would they think of her staying with a man who destroyed others for his own gain? If I go with you, she said slowly, I want to take the evidence of what he's done. The marshal should know. Heath hesitated. That's dangerous, Grace. Grayson has powerful friends. So did those families he ruined, Grace countered. They deserve justice, and I can help provide it. They made their plans carefully. In 3 days' time, they would leave for Wyoming, taking only what Grace had brought to the marriage plus copies of the incriminating financial records. Heath would go ahead to prepare the way, and Grace would meet him at a predetermined location outside town. The night before their planned departure, Grace was awakened by the sound of horses in the yard. Looking out her bedroom window, she saw Harold dismounting, having returned unexpectedly early from his trip. Her heart sank with dread. At breakfast the next morning, Harold was unusually talkative, describing his successful negotiations in St. Louis. Grace responded appropriately, all while her mind raced with the implications of his early return. Could she still get away? Should she delay? I stopped in Denver on my return, Harold mentioned casually. Met with Judge Simmons. He mentioned seeing you there 2 weeks ago. Grace froze. She had never been to Denver during Harold's absence. There must be some mistake, she said carefully. Harold's eyes hardened. That's what I told him. My wife has been faithfully managing the ranch in my absence, not gallivanting around Denver. He paused, watching her. Then I began to wonder what else my faithful wife might have been doing while I was away. Grace maintained her composure with effort. I've been here, Harold, as you instructed. The ledgers are up to date, and the household has run smoothly. Yes, I checked the ledgers this morning while you were still asleep, Harold said, his voice dangerously calm. Interesting reading. Some pages seem to be missing. Grace's blood ran cold, but she kept her expression neutral. Perhaps they were misplaced. Perhaps, Harold agreed, though his tone suggested otherwise. I also had an interesting conversation with Mills this morning. Seems Garrison gave notice while I was gone, planning to head to Wyoming of all places. Mr. Garrison mentioned wanting his own property someday, Grace said, struggling to keep her voice steady. Wyoming has available land. Harold's fist came down hard on the table, making the dishes jump. "Do you think I'm a fool, Grace? Do you think I haven't seen how you look at him? How he looks at you?" Grace stood, no longer willing to pretend. "What I think, Harold, is that you're a man who destroys lives for profit. I found the records, the payments to those men who drove the Petersons and the Callahans off their land." Harold's face darkened with rage. "You had no right to go through my private business matters." "You made me responsible for the accounts," Grace reminded him. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice? Or did you think I was too simple to understand what I was seeing?" "What I think," Harold said, rising from his chair, "is that you've forgotten your place. You're my wife, bought and paid for when I settled your father's debts." "I married you for survival," Grace acknowledged, standing her ground despite her fear. "But I've learned that survival isn't enough. I want more than this empty existence." Harold moved toward her menacingly. "You'll have nothing if you cross me. No money, no name, no standing in any decent community." "I'll have my freedom," Grace countered, "and my conscience." Before Harold could respond, there was a commotion outside. Through the window, Grace saw Heath riding into the yard at a gallop, followed closely by the marshal and several deputies. "What is this?" Harold demanded, striding to the door. Grace followed him onto the porch, watching as Heath dismounted and approached with the marshal. "Harold Grayson," the marshal announced formally. "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy, intimidation, and being an accessory to murder." Harold turned to Grace, his face contorted with fury. "You!" he spat. "You did this." "No," Heath interjected, stepping between them. "I did. When Grace told me what she'd found, I took copies of the evidence directly to the marshal. She wanted to wait, to be sure. I wasn't willing to take that chance with your safety," he added, looking at Grace. "You're fired, Garrison," Harold snarled. "And you," he said to Grace, "are finished in this territory. No one will take in a wife who betrays her husband." "She didn't betray a husband," Heath said, his voice steady. "She exposed a criminal, and she won't need anyone to take her in." As the marshal led Harold away in handcuffs, Grace and Heath stood on the porch, watching the man who had controlled her life disappear down the road. "I was coming for you today," Heath explained when they were alone. "I couldn't wait any longer, knowing you were here with him. Then I heard in town that he'd returned early." Grace leaned against the porch railing, suddenly exhausted. "What happens now?" "That depends on you," Heath said. "My offer stands. Come with me to Wyoming. Start fresh. But only if that's what you truly want." Grace looked around at Grayson Ranch, the property that had been both her prison and her protection. "I can't stay here," she said. "Too many memories. Too many ghosts." "Then don't," Heath said simply. "The world is wider than this ranch, this territory. You've survived, Grace. Now it's time to live." 2 weeks later, after Harold's preliminary hearing had established enough evidence to hold him for trial, Grace packed her personal belongings into 2 trunks. The ranch and its contents would be held in trust pending the outcome of Harold's trial, but Grace wanted nothing from her marriage beyond what she had brought to it. Heath was waiting for her with a wagon when she emerged from the house for the last time. Mrs. Daniels and some of the household staff gathered to say goodbye, their faces showing a mixture of disapproval and understanding. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Grayson?" Mrs. Daniels asked quietly. "People will talk." Grace smiled gently. "Let them talk. I've spent too long worrying about what others think, about maintaining appearances while ignoring what's in my heart." As they drove away from Grayson Ranch, Grace felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Ahead lay uncertainty, challenges, and the disapproval of society for a woman who left her husband, regardless of the circumstances. But beside her sat a man who looked at her with love and respect, who saw her courage and strength before her beauty. "Are you afraid?" Heath asked as they crested the hill that would take Grayson Ranch out of sight forever. Grace considered the question seriously. Yes, she admitted, but not of the future. I'm afraid I might have continued in that half-life forever if you hadn't shown me there was another way. Heath reached for her hand. You would have found your way eventually, he said confidently. You're too strong to accept mere survival for long. Where exactly are we going? Grace asked, realizing she knew only the vaguest details of their destination. A place called Willow Creek, Heath replied, about 20 miles from Laramie. Good water, good grazing land, room to build something that's truly ours. Ours, Grace repeated, savoring the word. I like the sound of that. Their journey to Wyoming took 2 weeks, traveling by wagon through Colorado into the southeastern corner of Wyoming Territory. Along the way, they stopped in small towns and settlements, camping under the stars on clear nights. Heath taught Grace to fish in mountain streams and to identify edible plants. They talked for hours around campfires, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, their hopes for the future. By the time they reached the land Heath had purchased sight unseen, Grace had shed the last vestiges of the proper Mrs. Grayson. Her skin was sun-kissed, her hands calloused from work, her spirit lighter than it had been in years. The property exceeded their expectations, a gentle valley with a year-round creek running through it, surrounded by rolling hills perfect for grazing cattle. A small weathered cabin stood near the creek, built by a trapper years before and long abandoned. It needs work, Heath acknowledged as they surveyed the dilapidated structure. But it'll do for now, until we can build something better. Grace walked through the single-room cabin, seeing not its current state, but its potential. It's perfect, she declared. It's ours. That first night on their land, after a simple meal cooked over an open fire, Heath took Grace's hands in his. I know we've done things out of the usual order, he said, suddenly looking uncharacteristically nervous. But I want to do this properly. He knelt before her, still holding her hands. Grace Bellamy, when your marriage is legally ended, will you become my wife? Not out of necessity or for survival, but because we choose each other, freely and completely? Tears filled Grace's eyes as she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will. Heath kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and passion and future. When they separated, he smiled at her in the firelight. You know people will talk. A woman living with a man who isn't her husband, even out here. Grace laughed, a free and joyous sound. Let them talk. We know the truth of our hearts. Over the following months, they worked side by side to build their ranch. Heath taught Grace everything he knew about cattle and horses, while she applied her knowledge of household management to their growing operation. They repaired the cabin for immediate shelter, then began construction on a proper house nearby. Word reached them through infrequent mail deliveries that Harold Grayson had been convicted of his crimes and sentenced to prison. A territorial judge granted Grace's petition for divorce on grounds of criminal misconduct, legally freeing her from her marriage. They were married the following spring in the new house they had built together, with a handful of neighboring ranchers as witnesses. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, their vows spoken with genuine love and commitment rather than practical necessity. I promise to love you as you deserve to be loved, Heath said, his voice clear and strong. To stand beside you as an equal, to respect your strength and courage, and to remind you every day that life is for living, not just surviving. I promise to love you with my whole heart, Grace responded, to build our future together as partners, and to never forget that true freedom comes from choosing love over fear. Their small ranch prospered over the years, growing from a few dozen cattle to a respectable herd. They added horses, chickens, and a large kitchen garden. Their house expanded with their success, room by room, until it was a comfortable home filled with books, music, and eventually, children's laughter. Their first child, a daughter they named Hope, arrived 2 years after their wedding. A son, Benjamin, followed 3 years later. Grace found in motherhood a joy she had never imagined possible, made all the sweeter by sharing it with a man who valued her as a person, not a possession. One evening, 10 years after they had first arrived at Willow Creek, Heath and Grace sat on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set behind the distant mountains. "Do you ever regret it?" Heath asked suddenly. "Leaving behind the security, the social position?" Grace looked at him in surprise. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. Even when we were living in that leaky cabin that first winter? Or when the creek flooded and nearly washed away our first calves? Or when the neighbors wouldn't speak to us until after we were properly married?" Grace laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Even then, especially then, those challenges were ours together. We faced them as equals, as partners." Heath put his arm around her, pulling her close. "You're an extraordinary woman, Grace Garrison. Do you know that?" "I'm just a woman who learned that survival isn't enough," she said softly. "A woman fortunate enough to find a man who said, 'Then live freely beside me,' and meant it with his whole heart." As twilight deepened into night, their children came running to the porch, full of stories and discoveries from their day's adventures. Grace watched Heath lift their daughter into his arms, listened to him answer their son's eager questions about the stars just beginning to appear overhead, and felt a contentment so deep it brought tears to her eyes. She had married for survival once, accepting a half-life of security without love. But here, on this land, they had transformed together. With this man who had shown her what true partnership meant, she had found something far greater: the freedom to truly live, to love without reservation, and to build a future limited only by the scope of their dreams. As the family moved inside for the night, Grace paused in the doorway, looking back at the thriving ranch that had grown from nothing but hard work and shared vision. The life she had now hadn't come easily. It had required courage to leave the known for the unknown, to risk judgment and hardship for the chance at genuine happiness. But standing there, watching Heath light the lamps that would guide their family through the evening ahead, Grace knew with absolute certainty that some risks were worth taking. Some journeys, however difficult, led exactly where you were meant to be. And some loves, once found, were worth any price, even the price of starting over with nothing but hope and the promise of freedom.